Yeah, I mean, maybe a bit of explanation about this talk before I begin. This is definitely not my usual thing. This is a very much a COVID redirection talk. So I took the opportunity of going down a few different pathways during these lockdowns and started reading a whole bunch of things I've not looked at before in the history of philosophy, and also more esoteric literature as well, and occult studies and things like this. So this talk is kind of a mixture of three talks I've given recently on what look like very different topics, but as I'll try and show, there's some sort of vague connection between all of these different projects. So one was a talk on Jung for the American Psychoanalytic Association just recently, and that was on synchronicity and the notion of creation in physics. And another one was at the Tucson Consciousness Conference, and that was on dual aspect monism, i.e. the idea that the mind-matter correlations come from splitting up some fundamental psychophysically neutral domain or object. And I was trying to merge that with the notion of musical meter as a way of probing closer beyond that duality, the mind-matter duality. And we'll see that cropping up in this talk a bit. And then the other was a talk at a conference I organized on being and nothingness in antiquity. So I should say I've got a project at the moment, a Templeton project called Wandering Mazes Lost, which this is heavily, very much related to, which is a history of investigations into the problem of why existence, right? Why there's something rather than nothing. And the idea is to go right the way back to the earliest recorded examples of explanations of why there's existence and why there's creation and what creation means and so on. In addition to that, the ARC project I've got going on is a project on the history of quantum gravity. And there's also a biography of a project on John Wheeler, who has this a particular approach to solving the problem of why existence, which introduces human participators into the picture. And really, quantum existentialism, the title refers to this idea of quantum mechanics somehow bringing in agency into the way that the world is created, into the way the objective world is created, right, with the subject as participant. And this is becoming a more popular approach, this idea of bringing the subject back into scientific disciplines after God knows how many centuries where it was considered to be extremely unscientific to do that kind of thing. So quantum existentialism is basically the idea that we are somehow involved in this creative process of bringing about manifest reality. So that's basically this jumble, and it will try and get to the common core of all of these various ideas. And I think, as I say, quantum existentialism is this thread that kind of links all of these, what look like very different things together. So this picture here, this group of people here are very much central, I think, to this idea of quantum existentialism. Got William James, Eddington, Jung, Pauli, David Bohm, John Wheeler, more recently Chris Fuchs. So I'll mention some of these people. They've all been labeled mystics in their time, because eventually what they start thinking about is this idea of a non-dual reality, and how duality, subject and object, emerge from this non-dual basis. Okay, so hopefully this will make some kind of sense, but we'll see. So I think the prevailing view of this problem of why there's something rather than nothing is probably along the lines of this Bertrand Russell quote. So this is from an interview in 1948 that he did with Copleston. And he was asked, why do you think there's a universe? Why something rather than nothing? And he said, well, I should just say the universe is there and that's that. So that's kind of very dismissive approach. It's almost kind of childish. It's just like, well, just cause, right? The universe is there because it is. But this seems to be the modern consensus, I would say. So we find Adolf Grünbaum, for example, calling it a pseudo problem in a relatively recent article. Sean Carroll, the physicist Sean Carroll, recently wrote a piece on this in the Handbook on Philosophy of Physics, the Oxford Handbook. Likewise, presents it as a kind of pseudo problem where you know your reasoning has gone wrong and you shouldn't be even asking this question. But I mean, this to me seems like it's like the philosophical version of Richard Feynman's shut up and calculate approach to physics, which maybe that's okay for doing physics, but if we're doing philosophy, I think we should sort of not be so dismissive of this kind of basic a question of why existence, especially when we have so many thousands of years dealing with exactly this question. And what's missing from this kind of account is this idea that, I don't know, as an old-fashioned kind of philosopher, what you want from an account of the world is that it satisfies, as we see here, hungering and thirst for immortality, our anxious longing to come nearer to and to know more of the eternal cause of all things. And, you know, that might be a very old-fashioned way of speaking, but what you find up until the early 1900s is precisely this kind of engagement with these kinds of questions amongst philosophers and scientists as well. So Hegel too says something similar, which is that, you know, surely that the aim of knowledge should be to divest the objective world that stands opposed to us of its strangeness, and as the phrase is, to find ourselves at home in it, which means no more than to trace the objective world back to our innermost self. So I think the general lesson, I think, from some of the things I'm going to be looking at today, is that we tend to treat the world's foundation as grounded in appearance or in the manifest world in this day and age. And I think that's a mistake, because obviously we can never expect to find an explanation of appearance within appearance. Okay, this was Leibniz's point when he was considering this problem of why there's something rather than nothing. In the paper where he first presents that expression for the problem, he has precisely this concern, which is you can't explain appearance within the realm of appearance. You have to go deeper. So all of the people I'm going to be looking at, John Wheeler, David Bohm, and so on, they were all trying to seek the appearance, which includes space, time, matter, and so on, and consciousness and whatnot, in something deeper, which doesn't have those features. Okay. So the Russell and Feynman kind of approach, it sort of looks like a smart strategy, you know, from our modern eyes, but they just really leave this strangeness untouched. And I might note that Wheeler's autobiography, one of his autobiographies, was At Home in the Universe, where he was precisely trying to find this kind of explanation that made sense of everything, didn't make you feel like an alien in the world. Okay, so the Templeton project I mentioned is called Wandering Mazes Lost. I'll say something about that title in a minute, but it is very much like a labyrinth dealing with this problem of why existence. Knowledge basically is sort of like a labyrinth. And why? Well, because the thing that you want to know is always sort of occluded in the process of seeking that knowledge. You've always got to split the world into you or me and it, and thereby you're always losing what you seek. You can never sort of understand this totality. So this is, you know, you can sort of follow Wittgenstein here and point to the essential unknowability of anything beyond the manifest and beyond what can be said. But obviously he didn't dismiss it first. He had to go through a massive convoluted maze of his own in order to get to that point, and then realize that, well, probably in the end, then you can't really say anything about the deeper nature of reality. And then, of course, later on, he's kind of speaking about letting the fly out of the bottle and letting this anxiety go. So the anxiety is nicely mentioned here by by a relatively recent study by Arthur Witherall on the problem of existence, where he says the unprepared person, when faced with the question of why existence, will realize that they've been living in a world for many years whose very existence is inexplicable to them. So again, where am I? Sorry. Okay. I mean, so like Arthur Witherall, I mean, my view is that why the world is here is sort of should be really the task of most people, of every human, right? It's part of why you are here. So life has thrown this problem at you. And again, what you see in recent literature, I'm thinking of David Chalmers' recent book, Reality Plus, I think it's called, where he's talking about, would it matter if the world were a simulation or not? And I think a lot of the people who would dismiss this problem of why there's something rather than nothing would say, no, it wouldn't matter whether reality was a simulation or not. Everything would proceed exactly the same way as before. So I think you end up sort of with two classes of people, those who care about whether they're in a simulation and want to know about the fundamental nature of reality, and those who don't care, who think all that matters is, well, we know how the world is going, how the manifest appearances will carry on going, and so on. So I'm in the camp where I think it does matter, really. So as I said, during that COVID lockdown, I read masses of literature that I wouldn't previously have touched with a barge pole, we say in Yorkshire. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. And I think there's a continuous story that can be told going right the way back to the earliest recorded texts, right the way up to people like John Wheeler, and more recently the quantum Bayesians in the context of physics. And again, we find this idea that ultimately there's a domain that you can't really say anything about other than by abstracting from it and splitting it. So this is from a book called The Light of Asia, and it's very Wittgensteinian. So he says, measure not with words the immeasurable, nor sink the string of thought into the fathomless. Who asks does err, who answers errs, say naught. I mean, that's total Wittgenstein, basically. Don't speak of, whereof you can't speak, just stay silent. Okay. So this is William James, and so the title Wandering Mazes Lost of the Templeton Project comes from this book of his, Problems of Philosophy, this posthumously published book. And he's got a chapter on basically how comes there to be a world at all, is how he puts it, and might well have been. And how he expresses it is like this. So he says, our mind is so wedded to the process of seeing another beside every item of its experience that when the notion of an absolute datum is presented to it, it goes through its usual procedure and remains pointing at the void beyond, as if in that lay further matter for contemplation. In short, it spins for itself the further positive consideration of a non-entity enveloping the being of its datum, and as that leads nowhere, back recalls the thought towards its datum again. But there's no natural bridge between non-entity and this particular datum, and the thought stands oscillating to and fro, wondering why was there anything but non-entity? Why just this universal datum and not another? And finds no end in wandering mazes lost. Indeed, a certain Professor Bain's words affirming the end of the mystery in a complete vision of science when all has been encompassed with the most general of scientific laws are so untrue that in reflecting men, it's just when the attempt to fuse the manifold into a single totality has been the most successful, when the conception of the universe as a unique fact is nearest its perfection, that the craving for further explanation, the ontological wonder sickness, arises in extremist form. As Schopenhauer says, the uneasiness which keeps that never-ending resting clock of metaphysics in motion is the consciousness that the non-existence of the world is just as possible as its existence. So this Professor Bain, who he mentions, sounds a bit like another sort of modern dismissalist, namely Lawrence Krauss, who you probably know has a book where he thinks he's solved the problem of why there's something rather than nothing, by just pointing to modern physics and saying, well, look, we have quantum field theory. That tells us that there can be fluctuations from the vacuum. The universe can just be considered a fluctuation from the vacuum. Voila, there you go. As if that's resolving the depth of the problem as people like William James means it. Obviously, the vacuum is not nothing. You're not getting something from nothing. You're getting something from very much a lot of stuff, which is a lot of energy in the vacuum, namely. Okay. Now, a really nice interesting feature of this problem of why there's something rather than nothing, when you study it from a historical point of view, is that what you see is that there are phases in which the nothings and the somethings and the what is considered an explanation changes over time. So what might be a good explanation for why there's something rather than nothing in the, you know, in 3000 BC, and you have a different conception of what there is going to be probably not so good when you get to contemporary physics and contemporary thinking. For one thing, you've got a whole different toolkit as regards modality. So obviously, when you're looking at the older works, you don't have modal logic. I've got a cat diving on me here. Go away. You don't have modal logic to ground the notions of the idea of the possibility that there might be nothing, right? That's something that takes time to develop. The notion of an explanation changes over time, of what counts as an explanation. Again, it's connected to logic and mathematics and all of these other disciplines. So you have something, as Philip K. Dick puts it here, that there's no route out of this maze because the maze keeps shifting as you move through it, because he thought the maze was alive. He really did think the maze was alive, by the way, as in he thought reality was a living organism that he called Zebra. Very interesting. By the way, if you've not read it and you're into sort of fundamental thinking, Philip K. Dick's Exegesis, which is this huge volume of his unpublished, what was then unpublished thinking, is, I think, one of the greatest philosophical works of all time, and I think it'd probably be known as one of the great philosophers eventually. And I have to say, I'm becoming more of a dickhead with age, as they call themselves, people that like Philip K. Dick. It's fantastic stuff. So what appears to be revealed as we keep looking through all of these changes in the somethings and the nothings is that the problem keeps changing, and we just get a new veil put in front of, you know, in between the subject and the object every time. So this is a bit like the philosophy of science problem known as the pessimistic meta-induction argument, right? The idea that, you know, in the past, we've been very confident about our scientific worldviews, and we thought this is definitely the correct picture of reality. And then it gets overturned completely. And if you're a Kuhnian, that means the worldview gets replaced with a completely different worldview. And something similar goes on at a deeper level with respect to things like modality and nothingness and the concept of an object and things like this. So it's a very similar problem. And ultimately, I think it's unsolvable. And I think my thinking at the moment is that this problem of why there's something rather than nothing is a very deep question, but it's unanswerable in a certain sense. So on this historical problem that I'm working on the problem of why there's something rather than nothing, you can sort of split it into a few different dimensions. So there's a linguistic feature, which is tracing the expressive capability of the languages of the particular period of time that you're looking at. Some periods, some cultures simply don't have the expressive scope to be able to speak about the problem in a certain way. They don't have a solid enough concept of nothingness, the notion of absence and these kinds of things, and negation, to be able to set them up. So there's an interesting linguistic component to this problem. Likewise, a logical, cultural, mythical, theological, mystical, philosophical. There's an individuation problem as well, which is always a problem when you're doing historical research, which is, are you even talking about the same problem? Is it even possible to do this kind of research? Because that would mean that you're finding the same problem expressed over time, despite the fact that we've just said that there are different linguistic conventions in the different periods and in the different places. So this is it's a hell of a historical project. We'll see how I go with it, but it's a lot of fun playing with it. To get a bit of control over this problem, you can also slice it into particular categories, taxonomic categories, the answers into particular categories. So there's the issue of whether the account that's given of, you know, the answer to the problem of why there's something rather than nothing involves ex nihilo creation, or involves some sort of eternally existing cosmos, whether it's infinite or finite, whether it's purely immanent, or whether there's some transcendental component that brings it into existence, whether there's eschatological elements or whether it's open, whether there's a divine plan, or whether it's random and arbitrary, whether there's unique creation versus multiple creations, whether there are anthropic elements or non-anthropic, monist, dualist, whether there's fate and free will or free will in the universe. So I'll focus on a few of these categories in the remainder of this talk. So I think these three divisions crop up quite a lot in what I'm going to be looking at. Okay. So the oldest text in which you can see a pretty much a clear expression of the problem of why there's something rather than nothing is from one of the hymn of creations from the Rig Veda. So it says, whence did this manifold creation sprang? Okay, which is pretty clear. It's almost Leibniz. And then it goes on to say there was neither non-existence nor existence then, neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond, what stirred where in whose protection. There was neither death nor immortality, no distinguishing sign, night nor day. The one breathed windless by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. So one of the standard objections to these, I call them quantum existentialists, but they're known in the literature as participatory realist approaches to quantum mechanics. What they have in common is that it makes the world outside of the participator ineffable, because it's the participator that brings the objectivity of the world into being, right? The dualities, the opposites. So it makes it manifest. And one of the standard, as I say, one of the standard objections is that, well, we don't really want this notion of an ineffable not even a substance, some ineffable thing without essence into our physics. So there's a paper critiquing participatory realist approaches by Harvey Brown that makes exactly this point. But this idea that outside of the participators bringing the world into being, there's this ineffableness is a crucial, it matches this older thought that you find in the Rig Veda. And it's a crucial part of the idea that quantum mechanics allows for creation in a way that classical mechanics doesn't. So classical mechanics has this deterministic character. It's kind of, it can be made consistent with a block universe very easily and these kinds of things. Quantum mechanics, for many people who study quantum mechanics, seems to have a bit more freedom than classical mechanics. So we'll constantly see this reference to the idea that nature is not a machine in quantum mechanics like it is in classical mechanics. And it's pretty interesting to see how close a lot of these older writings are to the way people are now talking about the sort of the world outside the measurement in quantum mechanics. So you find a similar way of speaking in the Maccabees and a lot of the biblical texts. So this is from the Maccabees. I ask you, son, look to heaven and earth, and seeing all things in them, be aware that God made them from non-being. Okay, so essentially what this world is beyond the observer and the subject is it's no thingness, right? There's no manifest things because it's the participation that brings the thingness into being. Okay, so that will be the point of this quantum existentialist approach. So that contrasts pretty strongly with what I suppose is the modern viewpoint, which is more of a block universe. So you can find this, I think, I'm not sure whether this is the first example of something like the block universe, as long as you don't include Parmenides' view is very different. This from Cicero looks more like what we mean by the modern notion of a block universe. So he writes, for the things which are going to be do not come into existence suddenly, but the passage of time is like the unwinding of a rope, producing nothing new, but unfolding what was there at first. So this is a bit like a famous line from, what's his name, from Hermann Weyl, who's talking about how you can get the appearance of time's flow in special relativity, where there seems to be a block, this Minkowski space-time block. And his idea is, well, no, the time flow is just this crawling of the consciousness along a world line, producing nothing new, but unfolding what was always there, essentially. Now, obviously, William James, well, you might not know this, but William James coined the term the block universe. And he meant it as a term of disparagement, because, I mean, he thought it was a terrible kind of world where you don't have any loose play. It's basically a machine in which the only modalities you have are necessity and impossibility, right? There's no notion of real possibility in a block universe. So he viewed the world as a kind of pliable thing that he called a pluriverse. And the idea is that it comes into being in drops and is more like a work in progress, with humans, with agents essentially involved in this process. So an example of this more block universe approach can be found in almost all modern physics texts that deal with the topic of time and determinism and whatnot. So this is from Steven Weinberg's book, The First 3 Minutes. So he says, it's almost irresistible for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not just a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, but that we were somehow built in from the beginning. It's hard to realize that all of this, all life on Earth, is just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. So I think that's probably more characteristic of today's picture, and it's a pretty grim picture. And I must admit, I used to buy this block universe. I was very much a blockhead, as Jeremy Butterfield, no, John Ehrman refers to them. I now don't buy this picture at all. I think it's an extremely damaging picture for reasons I'll come to towards the end, because it basically removes all agency from humanity, who are just thinking, well, this is terrible, the world's awful, we can't do anything. And then they just sort of collapse in despair. So something very different can be found in a lot of the older creation myths. So this is from a Nahua creation myth from Mexico. This is what Quetzalcoatl is supposed to have said in one of these myths, that the gods are anxious that someone should inhabit the earth. And you might ask, well, why that is? Why would a god want humans to inhabit the earth? And I think it's because there should be the idea that there's some sort of co-creational, participatory interaction going on. And this, you can find this strongly expressed in C.G. Jung's book, Answer to Job. So he writes here that the cosmic meaning of consciousness became overwhelmingly clear to me. What nature leaves imperfectly art perfects, say the alchemists. Man, I, in an invisible act of creation, put the stamp of perfection on the world by giving it objective existence. This act we usually ascribe to the creator alone, without considering that in so doing we view life as a machine calculated down to the last detail, which, along with the human psyche, runs on senselessly, obeying foreknown and predetermined rules. In such a cheerless clockwork fantasy, there's no drama of man, world, and God. There's no new day leading to new shores, but only the dreariness of calculated processes, which is very Weinberg. Weinberg is saying, yes, that's fine, I'll go with that. And then he continues, my old Pueblo friend came to mind. He thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help their father, the sun, to cross the sky each day. I'd envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief, and had been looking about without hope for a myth of my own. Now I knew what it was, and knew even more that man is indispensable for the completion of creation, that in fact he himself is the second creator of the world, who alone has given to the world its objective existence, without which, unheard, unseen, silently eating, giving birth, dying, heads nodding through the millions of years, would have gone on in the profoundest night of non-being down to its unknown end. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of meaning. So there's something like the Greek concept of henosis, or uniting with the divine, in this kind of picture. It's also known as theurgy, or divine working, which is familiar to Neoplatonists. So Iamblichus, in his book on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians, thought that this kind of theurgy was an imitation of the gods. And the idea was that this was a sort of ritualized cosmogony that endowed souls with the divine responsibility of creating and preserving the cosmos. So it's not just in this Nahuan creation myth. You can find it running through a lot of the older texts, especially of the Neoplatonists. So this passage of Jung's presents another key aspect, which is that there's sort of a latent meaning in the world on this kind of view. So he says, I can't really read that with these screens in the way. How do I move it? I'll move them to elsewhere. Never mind. Try and read it from here. So he says, since the laws of probability give no ground for assuming that higher syntheses, such as the psyche, could arise by chance alone, there's nothing for it but to postulate a latent meaning in order to explain not only the synchronistic phenomena, but also higher syntheses. Meaningfulness appears always to be unconscious at first, and can therefore only be discovered post hoc. Hence, there's always the danger that meaning will be read into things where there's nothing of the sort. Synchronistic experiences serve our turn here. They point to a latent meaning which is independent of consciousness, i.e. in this domain beneath. Since a creation without the reflecting consciousness of man has no discernible meaning, the hypothesis of a latent meaning endows man with a cosmogonic significance, a true raison d'etre. If, on the other hand, the latent meaning is attributed to the creator as part of a conscious plan of creation, then the question arises, why should the creator stage manage this whole phenomenal world, since he already knows what he can reflect himself in? And why should he reflect himself at all, since he's already conscious of himself? Why should he create alongside his own omniscience a second inferior consciousness, millions of dreary little mirrors, when he knows in advance just what the image they reflect will look like? So this idea that man participates in the construction of reality as a second creator or co-creator is broadly existentialist in nature. And you're ending up with a situation where there's no easy division between cosmos and humanity. As I'll mention, there are interpretations of quantum theory that place humans in the world as an agent whose decisions and actions shape the world in a participatory manner. As I said, that's what I'm going to be calling quantum existentialism. And I think Bergson has a very similar viewpoint to this. And so he, in this book, Two Sources of Morality and Religion, says that the essential function of the universe is a machine for the making of gods, for very similar reasons to Jung. And even more succinctly, we find James saying the universe equals God and company limited, where we are company in that we're objectifying the universe and with our questions that we ask it and our actions. So what's interesting is that you find both Bergson and especially William James explicitly credited with inspiring these participatory realist approaches to quantum mechanics. So Niels Bohr, who is sort of the father of these kinds of approaches, was directly influenced by Harold Hofding, who wrote a book on William James, who passed on all of this information about William James to Bohr, who acknowledged that he was very inspired by these kinds of ideas. But I mean, commonly in scientific theories of the modern era, we think that this is a terrible thing to do, to be introducing humans, to be making them special. Schrodinger has a great little book from his Tana lectures called Mind and Matters, where he is one of the early ones of the last century who tried to introduce humans and the observer back into the study of science. And he thinks basically the Greeks were the problem with sort of hacking out humans from the way we studied the natural world. So this picture is, the example he gives is of this picture, All Saints, which is by Dürer. And you might see in the corner, in the bottom right corner, that little person there is supposed to be Dürer. He painted himself in as this tiny little figure, a humble side figure, as Schrodinger put it. So Schrodinger writes that this momentous step, cutting oneself out, stepping back into the position of an observer who has nothing to do with the whole performance, has received other names, making it appear quite harmless, natural, inevitable. It might be called objectivation, looking upon the world as an object. The moment you do that, you have virtually ruled yourself out. So, as I say, the way Schrodinger expresses it is he sort of compares it to the reflexive appearance of the creator of a work of art, Dürer here, within one of their own works. So for Schrodinger and for many others who I call quantum existentialists, you can never really take the observer and the subjective perspective out of science. It's always presumed, but usually we just pretend like it's not there, and we're looking at an objective world as it really is, independently of the subject. So a nice expression that gets us across, a nice definition of existentialism that gets this point across is from this book by Yalom, Existential Psychotherapy. So he says that the existentialist position challenges the traditional Cartesian view of a world full of objects and subjects who perceive those objects, because this position cuts below the subject-object cleavage and regards the person not as a subject who can, under the proper circumstances, perceive external reality, but as a consciousness who can participate in the construction of reality. Okay. And what is essential for that, I think, is that we have this notion of a stage or a realm in which we don't have the duality. So this is from one of the Egyptian papyruses from the British Museum, talking about magic, which is understood as the bringing to being of thoughts or ideas. So as it puts it, I am he whom the unique Lord made before two things, duality, had yet come into being. So it's almost related to these old ideas of this notion of primeval waters and the primordial chaos and these kinds of things, where there's not yet differentiation, where it hasn't been conditioned yet. And if you're going to have a creative approach where participators in reality can create things themselves, then you have to have a realm where there's nothing manifest yet. So there has to be a realm of no thingness in order for creation to be possible. And this is what we find in a lot of these approaches to quantum mechanics. I will jump over that. And what's interesting, so a lot of the books I was reading were from mystery schools and from occult sects and so on. One of these is this book, The Secret Doctrine of the Rosicrucians, who very much have a similar view, actually. So they say, so in this book we find the following passage, that strictly speaking, the infinite unmanifest is a nothing rather than a thing. And yet not such a nothing as implies notness or not, but rather such a nothing as implies the possibility of everything, yet without the limitations of thingness. Now, anybody knows Heidegger's discussion on nothingness, which was parodied by Rudolf Carnap somewhere. I think he ended up saying something like the nothing noths, which looks pretty similar to this expression here. But the point is, if you're going to be able to create, if you're going to have real, genuine possibilities, then there has to be a situation where nothing is yet conditioned. So it's something like this kind of diagram. Okay, there's a sort of this unmanifest realm where there's possibilities that haven't yet been actualized. And then somehow, and this is the participatory realist approach, we get from there to actuality. We make a decision, choose something actual. The world makes a decision which one it's going to pick, and we get manifest reality from out of that. Okay. Right. So I said John Wheeler. So John Wheeler was Richard Feynman's PhD supervisor, by the way. So he came up with such notions as wormholes and space-time foam and black holes, coined the term black hole and so on. And he invented this little symbol you can see at the top of the eyeball here to describe his particular participatory realist approach, his quantum existentialist approach. The idea is that we ask certain questions of the world by deciding which experiments to perform in quantum mechanics. And by doing that, we have some role in what gets actualized. So when he's discussing this view, he quotes directly from William James's Dilemma of Determinism. The quote is, "Actualities seem to float in a wider sea of possibilities, from out of which they were chosen, and somewhere in determinism says such possibilities exist and form part of the truth. So they form part of the truth, but not part of manifest reality. So what are being called possibilities here is not that much different from these primeval waters of what we associate with more primitive worldviews. And it's really what offers scope for action by the will on the world, I think. And as he puts it again, so will is at its heart, says Wheeler, because the observer participator converts conceivability into actuality. Okay, so remember, this is like a serious physicist has some very serious discoveries in physics. It's where the notion of it from bit comes from. He grounded this, is saying that humans, observer participators, are somehow responsible for converting what is genuine possibility, indeterminism, into actual manifest phenomena. So this looks a lot like what anthropologists, what Levi-Bruhl calls participation mystique. Okay, so Jung's explanation of this here is that it denotes a peculiar kind of psychological connection with objects, and consists in the fact that the subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it by a direct relationship, which amounts to partial identity. The identity results from an a priori oneness of subject and object. So this essentially comes from Niels Bohr's view of quantum mechanics. So Wheeler was a PhD, a postdoc of Niels Bohr, and he presents the view of Bohr as the orthodoxy, and he's surprised when he finds out that Kurt Gödel does not believe this view. So he says, I was quite startled a few months ago at that little party of Oscar Morgenstern's to learn that you believed in the existence of what is sometimes called an objective universe out there, in contravention of the consequences of the quantum principle as presently envisaged, i.e. by what we now know as the Copenhagen interpretation, right? That associated with Niels Bohr. So what's being ruled out is precisely this notion that the world sits out there with its properties waiting to be discovered. Now, the way Niels Bohr put it in an early paper was like this. So he said that the epistemological problem under discussion may be characterized briefly as follows. By describing our, sorry, I can't actually see the whole of this slide, unfortunately. So I've got these videos in the way. The epistemological problem under discussion may be characterized briefly as follows. By describing our mental activity, we require, on the one hand, an objectively given content to be placed in an opposition to the perceiving subject, while on the other hand, as is already implied in such an assertion, no sharp separation between object and subject can be maintained, since the perceiving subject also belongs to our mental content. From the circumstances follows not only the relative meaning of every concept, or rather every word, the meaning depending upon our arbitrary choice of viewpoint, but also we must in general be prepared to accept the fact that a complete elucidation of one and the same object may require diverse points of view which defy a unique description. So you probably know about this famous debate between Bohr and Einstein, and it was precisely over this question of whether the objective universe, whether there is a world as it really is out there independently of our concepts, our minds, of subjects, and so on. So Einstein, of course, thought that there was, and his distaste with quantum mechanics was not so much probabilities, but it was more a case of God not needing humans to create the world, right? The world was already as it was. So he wanted a fully objective description without any kind of baggage of mankind, no subjectivity or anything like that. So Einstein assumes that there is a state of the universe as it is out there independently of our minds. As Wheeler mentions here, in the last talk Einstein ever gave, some months before his death, to his seminar on relativity, he explained how he'd come to relativity and what relativity meant to him, but went on to express his discomfort with quantum mechanics theory. if a person, such as a mouse, and I like the fact that he calls a mouse a person there, looks at the universe, does that change the state of the universe? So Einstein just couldn't accept that a consciousness or a participant or an observer could have any impact on what the state of the universe outside of the subject was. Whereas Bohr was of the opposite opinion, and those that came after him, like Wheeler, and like what I've called the quantum Bayesians, think otherwise and think that when we're making quantum mechanical observations, we're sort of participating in small moments of creation, essentially. So this from Jung again. So if God's consciousness is clearer than man's, and the creation has no meaning, and man no raison d'etre, in that case, God doesn't play dice, as Einstein says, but has invented a machine which is far worse. So that's the crux of the issue, is that what Einstein wants, essentially, is a machine in which all the parts fit together logically, and if you adjust any of them, the whole system will collapse. So he describes this when he's dealing with his unified field theory later on as a logically isolated system, right? A perfectly logical system which has no usage for humanity or anything like that. So he presents basically what is a kind of machine. So obviously, you know the expression, the world is a mirror of my freedom, which is the standard existentialist remark. We find Wheeler giving what looks like a direct response to this kind of remark of Carl Jung's. It's not a direct response, but it looks like it. So he says, nature at the quantum level isn't a machine that goes its inexorable way. It's wrong to think of the universe as sitting out there. Instead, what we get depends on what question we put to it, what experiment we arrange, what registering device we choose. We're inescapably involved in bringing about that which appears to be happening. Now, you might think that this could apply to anything, any theory. It doesn't have to be quantum mechanics, but quantum mechanics is what is motivating this particular view, because of certain features such as the Koch and Specker theorem, which don't allow you to sort of envisage quantum systems with their properties attached to them independently of experimental contexts. And there's also the non-locality theorems of John Bell as well, which seem to suggest something similarly. So there's something especially quantum about this. It's not just a general thing to do with how we create knowledge. It's supposed to be coming from quantum mechanics itself. And so I still don't know whether to call this existentialism or Jontology, because I think John Wheeler gives the best explanations of what's going on here. So the idea is that no, if you don't have a participator that chooses the experimental arrangements, then you don't get an objective world. So you probably all know the double slit experiment, where you fire some photons through a pair of slits and you're looking at what pattern it makes on the screen. And depending on where you put your measuring apparatus, if you put the measuring apparatus at the slits and you decide to measure at the slits, then you will get a different result, a different kind of interference pattern on the screen than if you don't do that measurement. So your decision of which measurement to take rules out other possibilities of measurement. So that's what's special about quantum mechanics in this case. So as he puts it here, we used to think that the world exists out there independent of us. We, the observer, safely hidden behind a 1 foot thick slab of plate glass, not getting involved, only observing. But we've concluded in the meantime that this isn't how the world works. We have to smash the glass, reach in and install a measuring device. When we install that equipment in place, it prevents the insertion of this in the same place at the same time of equipment that would measure the momentum. Okay, this is basically just the uncertainty relations. We're inescapably involved in coming to a conclusion about what we think is already there. What we thought was there is not there until we ask a question. No question, no answer. And the vital act here, so it's not just a case of subjectivity. There has to be agency involved here. So as he puts it, the vital act is that of participation. participator is the incontrovertible new concept given by quantum mechanics, strikes down the term observer of classical theory, which is passive, the man who stands behind the thick glass wall and watches what goes on without taking part. So a sensible updating of our physics would almost be like a kind of cybernetics, like a second order cybernetics, where you have to include the agent that's performing the measurements into your modeling. And some examples of this kind of thing are happening in recent work. So where this leads to, this view of Wheeler's in its most recent incarnation, is known as quantum Bayesianism or cubism, and it's associated with Chris Fuchs, pictured here. He takes on board this idea that he's a Jamesian, for one thing. So again, he acknowledges William James as being an inspiration. He believes that what this means is that there is real indeterminism. You can't have a block universe, and there's real possibility. And he argues that when you are making measurements, you are sort of bringing about a little bit of reality in a Jamesian kind of way, William James kind of way. So as he puts it, he says that our actions matter indelibly for the rest of the universe, for quantum mechanics signals the world's plasticity. With every quantum measurement set by an experimenter's free will, the world is shaped just a little as it participates in a kind of moment of birth. Again, this is kind of not bizarre, flaky, new agey quantum mechanics kind of stuff. Chris Fuchs was responsible for work on things like the no cloning theorem, which is one of the bases for quantum information theory and so on. He's a hardcore physicist, but this interpretation is pointing out that participators and acts of free will serve to co-create the world, which is quite startling, I think. So the way Wheeler described this realm when you are not making measurements on the world is as Bohr's great smoky dragon. So he says we have to recognize a new animal in the zoology of nature, beyond particle, force, space-time geometry, and it's the elementary quantum phenomenon. The great smoky dragon, Bohr's phenomenon, has a tail sharply localized at the point of entry to the apparatus. Its teeth are sharply localized where it bites the grain of photographic emulsion, but in between it's utterly cloud-like, localized neither in space nor time. So the search for the message of the quantum is a continuing pilgrimage marked so far by three great way stations: indeterminism, complementarity, and phenomenon. And you can in fact view that triple there of indeterminism, complementarity, and phenomenon as a kind of flowchart where you start from real possibility. The free will component is the decision of which experiment to perform, i.e. which question to ask of nature. And then the phenomenon is what nature spits out. And obviously you don't know what response you're going to get out, because theory is indeterministic and there's real chance in the world. So Wheeler spoke of getting definiteness out of indeterminism here. Okay. So the picture is something like this, I think. It maps on quite closely to dual aspect monism, which is that there's some domain, this Bohr's great smoky dragon, if you want to call it that, in which there's a synthesis of opposites. Nothing has been manifest yet. And that gets split when you make an experiment. Which experiment you make determines which objective aspects you are going to reveal in the world. Momentum versus position measurement, for example. So you're sort of in choosing, using acts of will on this subject side, which things to manifest, you sort of play some role in which objective aspect gets manifested. And again, this relates to some ideas of Jung. So he writes that the multiplicity of the empirical world rests on an underlying unity, and that not two or more fundamentally different worlds exist side by side. Rather, everything divided and different belongs to one and the same world. So that leaves a problem, which is what sense are we to make of this domain here? I mentioned at the beginning a lot of philosophers think that you should just basically not speak about this, because the only way you can speak about it is by making this split into subjective and objective aspects. Wheeler himself went on a bit of a philosophical journey, trying to figure out something that would generate space and time and matter from some more fundamental elements. So he thought those elements might be propositional calculus, and he called this pre-geometry. He was trying to get the emergence of space and time out of this, out of mathematical logic, but it ended up collapsing because it still needs this notion of a participator, which he couldn't get emerging out of this fundamental basis in the same way as space and time. So that's where the quantum gravity aspect comes in. I'll skip that slide. So this is basically the last slide. So there's a thing called the free will theorem due to John Conway and Simon Cochrane, which is that if there is such a free will, if there is free will in humans, then basically the objective features of the world are not determined, not predetermined. There's free will in the world as well. What this leads to, as they put here, is that Theodore Roosevelt's decision to build the Panama Canal shows that free will moves mountains, which implies by general relativity that even the curvature of space is not determined. So the stage is still being built while the show goes on. Yes, I'm losing slides here. Okay, but I mean, in this new participatory approach, there's also a sort of opportunity here. So we can see a rosier future if we see ourselves as participators rather than as these Weinberg kind of characters. So the problem is making the world en masse more aware of this responsibility that they have, so as to stop the damage to the environment, for example. So the problem I have with the kind of remarks that Steven Weinberg was making in the earlier quote is that it robs humanity of agency and responsibility for their actions. So I think these sort of participatory approaches like quantum existentialism offers up not only a viewpoint that's closely aligned with this rich history of ideas from across time and space, not only does it fit modern physics perfectly well, but it aligns with societal engagement with the future of humanity as well. So incidentally, there's two recent books which go through a bunch of these themes, which have just come out. The Dual Aspect Monism book is already out, and this Life is Short one, which is an argument for the meaning of life based on some of these ideas, is out next month in October, and I will finish there. And then how do I stop sharing this screen?